We're going to go ahead and get started with the introductions since there are some new faces today. So we'll start here in Schenectady.
Michelle Cummings, facilitator.
Joe Cannabis, New York State AFL-CIO.
George Solis, Workers' Comp.
Stephanie Zufali, Workers' Comp.
Meredith Woods, Workers' Comp.
David Wertheim, Workers' Comp.
Matthew Mead, defense lawyer.
Lev Ginsburg, the Business Counsel.
Mindy Roller, New York City Law Department.
Glenn Petrozello, AmTrust.
Okay, and we'll move on to Rochester.
Brian Trick from Wegmans.
Richard Mascarito, Brookside Consultants.
Christy Dorado, Brookside Consultants.
Okay, and there's no one in Manhattan yet, so White Plains.
Hi there, Winston Kwa, Mount Sinai. Yes. Oh.
Okay.
Okay. Okay.
All right. Thank you.
And Carissa, we also have folks from Gen X and ExamWorks, which do we want to introduce them now or at a later point?
They could just say their names, right?
Okay.
Tim Bellini, ExamWorks.
Mandy Brown, yes. Crystal Carlotta Brown, ExamWorks.
Mike Bell.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah, so I guess we're gonna get started. Today's topic is cost of IMEs and the IME entity panel. And then, as always, we are listing the subsequent meetings that we're gonna have, quality of reports, process, fraud, review and discuss report, draft report, and final report. So we're almost at the midway point, and we do appreciate all of you making the effort to get here on a monthly basis. For today, the topic is IMEs, and we're going to start for the first half of the meeting by looking at some of the, drilling down into some of the data from the research that has been done on the cost of IMEs, with a focus on the cost for specialty IMEs, cancellation and no-show fees, payment for precluded IME reports, and the out-of-state fees. And once we reach a consensus or not on that topic relating to cost, we'll take a bit of a break and then roll into the presentations by the providers that are with us. So at this point, I'd like to turn it over to Stephanie to talk about some of the survey findings and share some of the data with all of us.
Thank you, Michelle. As reflected in the utilization study, the key findings related to IME cost are summarized here. As you'll see on the next slide, the cost varies significantly by and within specialty type. Most carriers do not pay for no-shows, which, as you may recall, occurs about 9% of the time. And if a no-show is paid, the average is $204. All of the cost data was collected from IME entities and represents data from the 2014 to 2016 study period. It includes in-person IME costs only, not any costs associated with record reviews. This table shows that the average payment for IMEs is $571, as reported by the IME entities. This average payment includes exams performed both in-state and out-of-state. And again, costs associated with record reviews are not included in these amounts. You'll see that there is a wide variation in average payment amounts based on specialty type. In-person IME services for chiropractors average $396, and for psychologists average $1,001. Additionally, as shown by the minimum and maximum payments, the range within a specialty group can be significant. The board does not have sufficient data to determine the reasons why some of the maximum payments are so high, in some cases over $10,000. During our stakeholder calls, some expressed concern about whether the provider should be paid when an injured worker fails to show up for an IME. As you may know, in New York State, there are no regulations covering whether a carrier must pay an IME provider for a no-show appointment. Based on the data received from the IME entities, it appears that there's a lot of variability whether a no-show fee is paid. The IME data shows that almost 51% of no-shows are not reimbursed by the carriers. And when a payment is made, the average payment is about $204. This table shows that high-volume providers tend to get paid at lower rates on average than lower-volume providers. The average payment for providers who performed between 1 and 5 IMEs was $1,201. Providers who performed over 5,000 IMEs averaged $443 per IME. The median payments ranged from $400 for high-volume providers to $975 for low-volume providers. IME costs also vary by carrier. There were approximately 450 different carriers or payers represented in the IME entity data. This table shows that there is a pretty wide range of average payments by carrier. About 7% of carriers pay on average between $100 and $300 for IME exams. A little over 17% of carriers pay on average over $900 for IME exams. And again, the average payment for all IMEs is $571. IME costs also vary by location. This slide shows that the average IME payment is lower downstate than upstate. The downstate average payment is $460. The upstate average payment is $676. The statewide average on this slide is $547 and is lower than the previously mentioned $571 since it excludes out-of-state IMEs, which tend to have a higher cost. There are 2 handouts in your presentation package. Handout number 1 summarizes various other states' responses to the IA-IABC study questions regarding IMEs. There were 4 questions or statements surveyed of 27 states. The only one that applies to New York State is the first, which states that the requesting party is responsible for paying for the IME. They also asked whether there were fee schedules, whether there was a requirement to pay for no-show, and whether there was any additional charges for the IME reports. The second handout provides more detail on IME fee schedule amounts for the 16 states who indicated that they used a fee schedule for their IMEs. So I will now turn it back over to Michelle to help facilitate the discussion on IME costs.
All right, so if we go back to the survey findings on the cost, which is slide 5, is what is it about this data that concerns this group? Do we think that there are potentially explanations for some very specific specialty types to have very large maximum payments? Is it something that this group as a body should be making a recommendation on relating to cost? What do people think? Minnie?
Michelle, very candidly, I don't know that this is really such an important conversation for this committee.
Okay.
I believe that whatever the employers, contract with or agree to with IME companies is within, if we're going to talk about keeping costs down, I think this committee is more concerned with quality, with timing, with issues that really affect the claimant. I'm concerned about the cost as an employer, and we spend, a tremendous number, we do a large number of IMEs. We probably do, I think at this point, maybe about 175 IMEs weekly we schedule.
Okay.
So I'm concerned with cost, but I don't think that that's within the purview of this committee. I don't think it's an important factor.
And I think, again, if we go back to the operating premise in which we started, many of the things we are talking about were brought to us as things of concern.
Right, I'm not
And
faulting
so,
you, I'm just saying.
right, but maybe there's other things that we are looking at that would influence costs. I don't know. All of you around the table are the experts in
Right.
IMEs. We know that in upstate, we know that there's an access problem.
That's critical. There's an access problem even downstate. In fact, I'm just looking at this occupational medicine. Recently, we were looking for an occupational medicine doctor. We couldn't find one. We actually went without it because we couldn't find somebody to comment on something. It was a serious issue. We were concerned about it. We wanted confirmation one way or the other regarding the claim, and we weren't able to locate anybody who would be willing to do that exam for us.
Did you
So-
reach out to Dr. Kwon? He's an occupational medical doctor.
It was
And
not
he's
with-
on the same panel.
I know, but it was not within his field of specialty. But
Can I ask what kind of referrals are you for occupational medicine that you refer to, Mindy?
what do you mean, what kind of referral?
Like, what
We
kind
asked
of
our,
position?
we asked our IME vendors to please refer, we were looking for an occupational medicine doctor, and we were unable to find somebody willing to, or able to do the IME for us. Certainly within, not within the time frame. So yes, is there a question of, there's problems with availability, there's accessibility. I'm not saying there are no problems, I think there are very significant problems. I just don't think, cost.
You don't think the calculation of the cost is necessarily
Right.
within our purview?
Although I would say that IME companies, and you have some here today, will generally say that if you paid more, you'd be able to get more doctors in the system. From that perspective, maybe that's a concern. That I don't know. But again, that's sort of me as an employer to say, I need more IMEs, I'm going to pay more. I don't know that the system needs to impose that upon everybody.
Anyone else? Bob, Matt?
I just had a
It kind of
question
all goes
about-
hand in hand, right? So
Yeah.
costs, access, quality. So, yeah, I mean, there's a supply and demand of IMEs. What are the drivers of supply and demand? And then how does it affect time to get an IME? We've talked a lot about that in previous ones. So looking at pricing, we have looked at pricing before, certainly is a consideration to kind of understand the entire equation of how it all comes together.
I just had a question about the data. So I was looking for frequency of the IMEs performed by these different specialty areas, because obviously there's a huge
Which
variation.
slide are you looking at?
At 5. And I thought perhaps we had it in an earlier session, and I honestly didn't have time to go through and look. But, there's a huge spectrum of, cost here. But I'm wondering, like, how often, for instance, does a dermatologist do an IME versus an occupational medicine doctor versus, orthopedic surgeon? I would have to imagine orthopedic surgeons are a large percentage of these numbers, as are, probably one or two other specialty areas, and others are much less so. And that would, of course, explain a lot of the variation in my mind. So I'm just wondering if we had any data on frequency.
There, I believe we provided that data
I think we
when
did.
we
I
were
think
you
talking
did.
about access,
Yeah.
or, I don't know if it's in these exact categories, it might be rolled up a little bit.
Yeah.
But you're right, orthopedic
categories.
surgeons by far
Sure.
do the vast majority of IMEs.
So what you're suggesting is that some of these are specialties, right? Like on the higher end of the cost spectrum?
Well, I mean, dermatologists, they're in high demand all over the country, not just in the city, not just upstate. It wouldn't surprise me, that their numbers are relatively low here, but, it wouldn't surprise me that they'd be more difficult to get a hold of and therefore perhaps more expensive.
More expensive.
And the same with occupational medicine. And, those are variations we might not be able to control no matter what we do. I just want to know exactly. And I have all of the earlier stuff and I can make the comparisons myself. Just was wondering if we had it on hand.
I'm sorry, I do not have
That's
that
okay.
on here.
That's fine.
Hey, Michelle.
Yes.
Brian in Rochester, I have a question on slide 8, if we could, on the cost by carrier. I think that's an interesting way to look at it, but I don't know if it's the right way to look at that data, because you could have one carrier that writes 30% of the IMEs in the state. They could be in the $100 to $300 range, but it only shows them a small percentage of carriers. I think you should look at that based on a number of exams done by carrier to see if there's larger portions of carriers that are driving the cost down. which would then in turn maybe drive the cost up in other areas. If one carrier is driving the cost so low, it could affect everybody else paying in the system.
Yeah, what we could do is add to this slide by indicating the number of IMEs that are in each range. I think that would help put it in perspective.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Stephanie, does slide 5 include both in-state and out-of-state IMEs?
Yes.
So that's pushing those numbers up a bit.
It is.
Right.
I would expect that.
Right.
Okay.
Especially in the maximum payment column.
Right.
Actually, just a comment on that, and this is something, I know the board has, there are decisions on this, but the fact of the matter is that out-of-state providers, first of all, IMEs are extremely expensive. It's now, somebody comes into my office like once a week to say, we got an IME in South Carolina, but it's gonna cost us $3,000. So it's very expensive. What I think is possibly an alternative, sometimes claimants are still treating with their doctors here. So we try to coordinate, and we'll even bring them to New York if necessary. It's less expensive to pay for their airfare and put them up and have them examined than just pay an out-of-state IME. And then the out-of-state IME doctors don't know our guidelines, they don't know the schedule loss of use guide, they're not familiar with anything. So the report you get is often not on point, it doesn't address the issues you wanted them to address. So I do think maybe there is some way to address that as an issue of out-of-state IMEs, because they're exorbitantly expensive. Oh, and they usually have very, very costly no-show fees.
Can I ask one question? This is Winston Kwa. In terms of the maximum payments, like, do we have an idea, like, in terms of the ones that are excessively high, like over $10,000, what kind of examinations those were? Because I think those are big outliers. That if you average those high payments into the average IME payment, that will bring up the average IME payment, but then it may be a false sense of actually how much the average, let's say for occupational medicine, it may not be 1,600 because you have these huge outliers with the maximum payment.
So we did attempt to look at some of the high dollar payments to see if there was anything else being included in there. For example, interpreter fees or transportation, or maybe there was a lot of medical records to review or something. And we weren't really able to, my team was not really able to come up with a good comparison of why one would be 10,000 and another one would be 5,000. You know, perhaps if we gave a couple examples to our medical director's office and had them look at it, they would say, oh, well, this one's more complex and there's, you know, bigger issues or whatnot. But just looking at the specific IMEs, we were not able to figure out why one was so expensive and one was not.
Okay, thank you. And I just wanted to add, in terms of the dermatology, because as a treating OCMED physician, where I work, it's almost impossible to find any dermatologists that even participate in workers' compensation. So, like, I just wanted to bring up that point that I was surprised that even there were dermatologists that does IMEs when there's no dermatologist that's available to even treat patients or evaluate patients from where I work, which is the New York City, Lower Hudson Valley region. I can't find a single dermatologist that will take workers' comp.
I see we do have some folks that joined us in Manhattan. If you could introduce yourselves for the group, please.
Yes, Bill Turley from the Injured Worker Bar Association. Sorry I couldn't make it to Schenectady today.
It's raining.
Robert Goldberg, I'm physiatrist, past president of Medical Society of the State of New York. Hi, everybody.
Hi.
Do you want us to? You want us
Yes,
to identify?
sure.
Oh,
Yes.
Okay, I'm Elaine Silverberg, Board's Medical Director. And behind me is
Rita Foster.
Thank you. Okay, so I think we, oh, Joe,
I'm
sorry.
On the maximum payments, I mean, it's a silly question, but how do you define payment? Is payment for services performed on one case on one day, or on one case over a certain amount
It
of
was
time?
a transaction, one
Okay.
transaction.
So one, would that mean like one IME report, or could it be several reports?
It should be one IME report, so if there was an addendum, it would not be reflected in the, if there was an additional charge related to an addendum, that would not be listed here.
And so for, say, the, the 10,000 or above, is that a multi-day visit where the doctor needs to spend a very long time with an injured worker? Like, do you have any idea how much work went into the 13,000, the 11,000?
Not from an accountant's perspective.
Okay.
I don't, you can look at, okay, this is how many reports that they said they looked at, I was not able to, I didn't personally look at them. The team was not able to discern a, pattern in why some were more expensive than others. We can take another stab at it, maybe have different folks take a look at it and see if we can call out anything
The
as to
outliers,
why
right.
it's higher.
If it was the type of thing that took a week to do, it would make more sense. But if it's what we talked about before, I think the average is like 15 minutes, right? If it's a 15-minute office visit, then they get an assistant to type up a report that they then sign. I can't see how these are justifiable.
One could assume the provider spends several hours with the patient, but I don't know if any of the
I was going to ask
physicians would.
our medical director, see if she's seen any of these and what her take on it might be.
Well, we don't usually know payment, Clarissa.
Okay.
So some of the IMEs will come in, they'll be like long, detailed reports. Some will be, pointed to a specific issue, but we have no idea what the associated fees are.
Perhaps I may add something. I have examined patients that have been in the hospital for up to a year, in nursing homes for 2 or 3 years, catastrophic injuries, extremity fractures, spinal cord injuries, paralysis, being asked to review medical records to present material which may then be used for a life care plan. They're far and in between. So we're focusing on the maximum payment, that if you were to look at the end of that, I'm sure it's a handful. And if you look at the injuries, you'd be very grateful that we don't see more of them, and very sad for those that suffered that much.
We have somebody else who has a comment.
Yeah, I agree. I think that these are probably dealing with catastrophic injuries that involve maybe, modifications to the home or something like that, which of course is a very horrific, unfortunate situation. But I would guess that's for, especially in the psychology area too.
And often with other comorbidities, other illnesses, perhaps other workers' compensation injuries too, that have to be factored into account. Those are quite complex, and I don't believe there'd be many people that would be in a position to do them.
So as a follow-up, do you want us to count or, provide you a count of the number of cases that are over a certain dollar amount?
Well, if you had percentages by like some sort of categories, 0 to 5, 5 to 1,000.
Yeah.
I think that would be helpful.
Okay.
Like that. My guess is you'd see a handful in that, say over 10,000. Hopefully.
Actually, I think the point was well made in the sense that this particular category is occupational medicine, where it may well involve commenting on required adjustments to the home. It may be a much more in-depth analysis and evaluation than a 15-minute exam.
Even the workplace.
I'm just guessing, but just based on the category itself, it may require that, right, at the workplace, modifications, et cetera.
And let's not overlook the serious head injuries, not the mild post-concussion syndromes, but those that have had intracranial bleeds, residuals, neurosurgical procedures to get them back into society or not. Some are vegetative state individuals and house calls have to be made. It's very easy to focus on those, but we should be looking at the majority of them where the real expenses are for the for purpose of discussion, in my opinion. We'd be able to find those outliers.
Carrie, did you have anything else for that?
No, I just think that when you think about workers' comp, it's occupational med, right? And so when you think about the majority of backs, shoulders, knees, et cetera, you'll see that in some of the other buckets, but I think you're going to see a lot of volume in the occ med row,
Okay.
which is your run-of-the-mill, use the word run-of-the-mill IMEs.
All right, so for our purposes with this group, we're gonna ask the team to go back in and take a little bit of a deeper look at some of the data, and with the hope that maybe next time we can answer some of these questions on costs and the schedule itself. How about the cancellation, no-show payments?
I had a question about
Sure.
that. It's really a question for the doctors. So outside of workers' comp, when you're dealing with patients that are paying either privately or through other forms of insurance, do you charge for no-shows
Absolutely, yes.
to private insurers or to the individual?
Whoever it is that's requesting the examination,
I mean, a patient will call, right?
then that person's responsible for it.
For every no-show?
Yes.
And the rest of the doctors?
As Mount Sinai's policy, we don't charge for no-shows.
Is that all we got? I guess it is. Great, thanks.
Any questions on the data that's been aggregated up for us? And the idea of no-show payments generally? First on the data, is there any questions or a deeper look at what Stephanie and the team have pulled together?
Yes, and this applies not only to this slide, but I'd like to spread it across them. We do not know what the N is. We don't know what number this represents. And without it, it's very difficult to understand it. Because a payment of 0 is 50% of all carriers, that doesn't give me an idea as to the number of individual IMEs that were requested or scheduled. So
Yeah,
I
and
don't know,
this
I don't know
one-
how to understand any of these slides
Right,
because
so-
of that.
This particular slide is based on the, is it based on all carriers, or it's based on transactions? I thought it was 50%, 51% of transactions don't have, and we'll clarify, but,
And remember that when we saw the slides from the first day, there were over 150 to 250,000 in IMEs scheduled in the window that we're looking at. So the N would really make a big impact in all of these slides. We talked about an outlier. Is it 100 cases as opposed to the 9,000 that we saw one individual orthopedic surgeon doing? It'll tell us a lot.
I'm pretty sure this is based on transactions, so slightly over 50% of the transactions where there is a no-show, there is no payment for. But I agree that it's confusing the way it's labeled, so we'll confirm that.
Is it possible to take that earlier slide and apply these data to them at the end? Just expand the spreadsheet. Let's take a look at those. That way. Take this, add the numbers being done, the number of providers being done, and then the cost. Then you'll really have it studied. And then we should publish that.
I think that we can do that. We can take that as a takeaway.
And I'll be happy to work on the paper.
I mean, my hypothesis is that a high-volume IME doc that's doing 10, 15, 20 a day is less likely to charge a no-show fee, and a specialty doc in a part of the state whose time is more valuable is more likely to. I think that's what we would find if we cut this data by specialty type and volume and region.
But
That goes to the philosophy. There are things that we know and things that we believe we know. I'd like to see it.
But are you saying on this slide 5, I think we wanted to show the number of IMEs, we wanted to show the number of authorized providers in each of the specialty types. Are you saying you also
Yes.
want to see if we can provide the
maximum, the minimum we will have, let's do the no-shows superimposed upon this, because you don't discern the specialty at all for the no-show fees. It would be kind of interesting, and I would tend to agree that if somebody's doing 30 in a day, they probably don't have a no-show fee, which is one of the things that makes them attractive to whoever it is that's scheduling.
All right, so my confusion here is that the slide that we're looking at is by specialty, not by volume. But
Let's add volume to this. We have the volume from the earlier slide, put them together.
Is that possible?
maybe what we could do is we could add the columns to both 5 and 7. Those both.
Do it.
We'll take a stab at providing this both by specialty and by provider volume.
Thank you.
Do you also have the number of no-shows? Right, how significant is it? We're talking about 322,000 IMEs.
Do we have to take
To understand.
Yeah, so
the
it was
magnitude of the
9%, so whatever the math is there.
30,000.
Yeah.
Can you include it too?
The number
Stephanie,
of.
can you repeat that for everyone? Because I don't think.
The percentage of no-shows is 9%.
Okay.
So 9% of the 322,000.
9% of the total volume of IME transactions that occurred in that.
In that window.
Okay.
Yes.
Oh, it's a class, I'm sorry.
So you would like the number of no-shows that, by specialty, or also in the volume slide?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Thanks, Joe.
Okay, because, just so everyone's clear, it's my understanding that that additional drill down in the data will help us determine how significant of an issue this is, that if we were to make recommendations, we would want to address in a final report, correct? Yes?
Yes.
No? Thank you.
So to clarify with the slide before, we would take these 5,000 to 9,000 IMEs and identify them by specialty like we did with the earlier slide and put them together, if it can be done in an intelligible way.
Correct.
Well, the 5
Thank
to
you.
9,000 on the volume slide, those are all orthopedic surgeons.
Yes, so put that against the others and it makes a lot of sense. So then you'll see that the 9,000 being done, and if you look at the IME cost for orthopedics, it's one of the lowest on that grid.
Right.
It then becomes more understandable.
Just on the topics for discussion, does anyone have any thoughts on the IME fee schedule, handout 2?
As a doctor who does them, it's very difficult. California does it by the number of inches of medical records that are given. Others do it by the number of pages. And if one is given a deposition that's 345 pages long, some are very easy to read and others are reading a novella. And I challenge someone to offer a suggestion that does it. No one is happy with California, so I guess that means it sort of works. And it's just a question of how much it is per inch, and that's argued almost annually.
I think that introducing an IME fee schedule might exacerbate the problem we've already recognized with the availability of IMEs. The doctors might be less likely to sign up as IMEs if their fees are restricted in some way that they find unacceptable.
That's a good point.
Was that the case with the minimum level as well, do you think? If you set a schedule, there's a minimum fee, and then you have the upside range to go?
No, I don't think a minimum fee would have that effect. If there was a fixed fee for any IME, then I think it could have that effect.
I mean, it depends. Just look at fee schedules across the country. Low fee schedules create an availability problem. Adequate fee schedules, there isn't one. So it depends on how you establish the fee schedule, the rates by specialty.
If one looks at the bottom two categories of 1,000 to 9,000, that represents 287,000 IMEs.
Doctor, which one? Okay, thank you.
Slide 7. Slide 7.
Slide 7, thank you.
If you add up the 221 and the 65,000, you're at 287,000. When you compare that to the top part, and that's without a fee schedule, and that's between 443 and 511, I don't think it would help to put one in. Because you would be bumping those up to the next category, and I don't see how that would help. And what I heard at the table, which is also true, many of the orthopedic exams are for a single joint in a finger. It might be a wrist, it might be a forearm fracture. They're not the same as when you're looking at Ahmed, neuro, rehab, and the others, neurosurge. They're very different.
So we may appear to have consensus on that.
We do not.
You do not?
No. Providers have a fee schedule. I think we should at least consider implementing a fee schedule for IMEs.
What would the benefit be, Joe?
Mindy, I think that we shouldn't foreclose the possibility. I think it's something that we should continue to consider.
Okay.
A caution is that fee schedules tend to be ceilings. When we look at the difference in interpretation of the workers' comp fee schedule for no fault and workers' comp, one's a ceiling, one's a floor, it becomes difficult. What's it going to be? Depends on who you're doing it for or who one is doing it for. It's not so simple.
All I'm suggesting is that we don't foreclose the possibility.
I'm always open for discussion. I agree with you, Jeff.
Same here.
All right, so the parking lot should include a fee schedule. And, you know, any conversation, further conversation on that can be pending, a little bit deeper look at some of the data. The costs for precluded IMEs. Stephanie, can you explain that one a little?
There's no data on that, but it was raised as an issue by some of the stakeholders that if an IME is precluded, then often the payer, the carrier, will not pay for that IME, and then the IME entity or the IME provider ends up either not getting paid, or the IME entity has to pay the provider, and yet they don't get reimbursed. So it was an issue that was raised as something of a concern.
Was it an issue that was raised several times or by one?
I don't recall the
Okay,
number,
so we really don't know how
but
big of an issue this is.
No, this is an issue.
It is an issue, okay.
I mean, you're absolutely right, Stephanie. That's how it works. If our report is precluded, then we've essentially paid the IME company. If it was precluded because it doesn't get in on time. It's 11 days, you know, instead of 10. Then it's the IME company, it was the IME company's responsibility to make sure it was there timely. It wasn't in timely. We're now, we would be paying for a report that's worthless to us. So we don't pay in that instance. But that, again, is part of our agreement with our IME vendors. So, you know, I think that, just going back to this concept of a fee schedule, I think this is much more complicated, and I think that this system does not need another area of a cottage industry that'll grow up to address new problems. So I think that it's not necessary to consider a fee schedule, but I'm happy to discuss it further if it sounds like a good idea. But this issue of preclusion But this takes us back to the conversation about, how rigorous the requirements are in terms of getting your reports in timely, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it is a problem probably for IME companies, and you'll hear from them later, but there's a lot of downstream effect to this.
One of the concerns about working with an IME company is the availability of medical records that are being provided. And as an examining doctor, it's critically important that one reviews a comprehensive battery of materials and not materials that have been cherry-picked to be presented to the doctor. I've made the request a number of times, I'm going to repeat it today, and I know there are members around the table that don't like this request, that the physician who's being asked to do the IME should have access to the entire medical file, to know about the subject matter in front of them, as well as the other accidents that may or may not have been reported to the Workers' Compensation Board. This way, proper attention and weight can be given to the complaint, as well as to the history of the patient and the natural history of the diseases of not only the complaint, but the pre-morbid condition of that individual. Some of the reasons why the reports are not done in a timely fashion is the physicians are asking for more material. And to write a report when one is certain that there's information based on the history of the patient, there's more out there and it doesn't come, what is a doctor to do? If one completes that report, it's going to be blown out because it's inaccurate, it's insufficient, or prejudicial, either towards the claimant or in most cases against the claimant. So there are reasons why that date is exceeded. And as far as the payment on your side, well, I would make an argument that in many of these, it's because the doctor was not provided with the materials. And that doctor is hesitant to commit to a conclusion based upon inadequate or incomplete, if not inadequate, information.
Actually, that does raise up an issue that I think the board could address, and it's something maybe to consider, because this is really an issue. Would it be possible, because there's a certain hesitancy to allow doctors to look at some claimant's entire file, is it possible to allow doctors access to e-case and look at claimants, just the medical portion of the file? Could that, be something that the board could think about doing? Because that way, I may not want to let every IME doctor who's doing an IME for me see the whole file. It may not be necessary, it's probably superfluous. But if they could access just the medical documents, which are already segregated in e-case, it might be something to think about.
Just a question on that. Wouldn't you normally send them those pertinent documents, or do you need like a HIPAA release, or?
No, what the doctor's saying, and it's true, is he doesn't want it cherry picked. What we send may not be what he wants to see.
I see.
We try our best. We don't have doctors reviewing the medical to know what the doctor is going to want to look at. So that may be a real fix.
Okay. I don't know if that's something, I know it's come up before.
We talked about this, I think, in one of the prior ones. For the vast majority of IMEs, if you've got a 50-year-old patient, you don't have to look back to the last 30 years of their medical history to render an opinion on an ankle sprain.
Disability. That's true,
So-
but I think the doctor's point is well taken. There are cases where it would be helpful,
I might want to chime in. If there's an ongoing issue, I agree with whoever spoke before. If it's 30 years ago and the person's gone to a status quo ante, is one thing, but certainly 7 years I'd like to see. That's how long we have to maintain records in our office, or 6.5. And/or if an individual is still receiving benefits or treatment for an ongoing condition, and that might be 30 years. So I don't think all 30 years are necessary, but for some of the injured individuals, yes, because that 30-year-old injury might be the reason why that person's going for total joint replacement now.
Again, the vast majority, though, don't involve a patient that has 30 years of kind of a degenerative issue. So it's kind of what part of...
Does it come down to a question of who decides what documents are relevant? Is it the claims adjuster who sends the documents to the doctor? Is it the IME entity that transmits the request to the doctor? Or should it be the doctor who decides what records are relevant?
As far as the doctor goes, we may request it once we become aware of it. If a patient doesn't remember, is not forthcoming, there's a weakness there. And I would be very interested to know if the file that is sent to an IME corporate entity has any reflection as to the material that's forwarded to the doctor on in the next step. Can we look at that?
David, I'm kind of looking at you. Is there, I know this came up once before, but is there a reason that we couldn't do that? I know, who can see the file is the parties of interest, right? It's restricted, but, so does it have to be, let's say that the employer designates who the party of interest is, so they can have?
Yeah, well, doctors are not parties of interest, so that would be a pretty significant system change. I don't think technologically we have the capability of.
No, it's something that we're looking at for BIS, but it's not possible in CIS.
I don't think we have the capability of giving them a limited access view. And also there's other issues that could be associated with this legally.
Right,
like an old issue that had been, there had been a medical question and maybe there had been a resolution of it could have been stipulated to, could have been decided, and if it's kind of bled into the question that's now before that IME doctor, having access to that other information, which might be irrelevant to the current question, could complicate things. So that's why it's basically left up to the carrier or the carrier's agent to determine what's germane to the question that they're looking to have answered.
And I'd like to speak again. When one speaks of party of interest, I can't imagine anyone more critical than the treating physician who is addressing the medical needs in front of them at that moment. And if she doesn't have access to important information, that patient may not get what's in their best interest. So when I'm speaking of having a physician have access to the medical file, I'm particularly speaking of the needs of a treating physician. An example of which is an individual might go to an emergency room and get CT scans and x-rays and then present in a doctor's office weeks later, who then may want to request diagnostic imaging, which is already available. And if that file was accessed, the cost would go down, the rapidity with which the patient could go back to work would accelerate. And there are many, many benefits to allowing physicians, treating physicians, to have access to that file. And I haven't heard many that have moved me as to why not. Because when the doctor takes over the care of a patient, that patient signs a release and we send that to all the other treating doctors that we know of. But we cannot serve as the memory for that patient.
Anything, I think this is obviously something we're going to have to take a further look at. The parking lot. I think there's some very valid concerns that were raised.
Can we go back?
Sure.
I'm sorry, to preclude
Absolutely.
IMEs?
Yes.
So David, Mindy mentioned timeliness as one reason for preclusion. Is that the only reason why a report would be precluded?
No.
What are some of the others?
Off the top of my head, so it could go to, it could be an issue with the service of the IM, the service of the report, the filing of the report, like we talked about, same day, same manner.
Completion of the report.
There could be a technical defect in not signing the report, not providing all information, not providing an IME3, the doctor not providing the IME3 request for information, could be a communication violation. The board has a communication policy, proper communication policy, a violation of that.
Could be a failure to appear for deposition.
Right. That happens more on the claimant's doctor side, but because the IME doc is within the control of the carrier, but it definitely does happen as well on that side. So there's a bunch of reasons, and I'm probably leaving a few out.
Thank you.
But overall, it's estimated at about 1% of IME reports are precluded. So it's not a large number in the scale of things.
Not a significant issue.
And mostly ministerial, it sounds like.
A lot of them.
Mindy?
I'd like to put a sub-bullet under timing. It may include physicians waiting for additional records that either were not forthcoming or were slow.
Mindy?
I just wanted to say, this is one of the other statistics that surprised me. The idea that only 1% of reports are precluded is sort of,
Not many.
how is that measured? Because I find that to be a very low amount. I'm just curious.
Well, we went through and looked at the data that we had available in our claims information system and looked for the word precluded, basically, and counted the number of cases where it indicated IME was precluded.
Out of what was the pool of cases? In other words,
We looked during the same time period, 2014 to 2016. We looked at, I think it would have been hearings that would have covered that period, and looked for the words.
so it's measured against the number of hearings, not against the number of cases that
No,
were adjudicated?
what we did is we took the number of cases number of hearings where we saw documentation that the IME was precluded, and we compared that to the number of IMEs that occurred in that same time period. So a hearing, there were 350,000, whatever the number is, of IMEs that occurred between 2014 and 2016, and we looked for any hearings that occurred that would have been referencing an IME that occurred during that time period, and compared the percent or the number that said the IME was precluded to that full population of IMEs performed during that time period. We don't have a precise way of going, there's not an indicator saying IME was precluded, but we looked, so the weakness, I'll say, in the methodology that we used is if a judge used different language to say that the IME was precluded instead of saying IME was precluded, we would not have picked that up. If they used some other word than precluded, we would have missed that.
Right, but I guess what I'm asking is, there were many, this would appear in all cases versus well, I guess it doesn't matter. I understand, I still find it a surprising number. I'm not sure.
Hey, Michelle, this is Brian. I think you'll hear later on today that the need for IME vendor companies are, why the number may be 1%. If we had to do that ourselves, the number I think would be much higher for precluded IMEs. So I think if I hear that later today, I just wanted to interject my thoughts on that.
Okay, thank you. Michelle did have to step out, but the point is well taken, Brian. So the other subject area for discussion, just before we move on, was out-of-state fees. Mindy, you did mention that this is something that we should look at, because at least from an employer's perspective, they are costly at times. Does anyone else have any input on, or thoughts on the out-of-state fees for IMEs?
I wanted to point out just one thing factually based on something you said earlier, and that is that the permanency guidelines state that out-of-state doctors have to follow the guidelines.
No, I
Because
know,
you
but they
mentioned
are
that
not
they weren't.
usually, they're just not usually well-equipped to do so. We send them a copy of the guidelines, but they're just not as familiar with it, and invariably there's something,
Yeah, no, I understand. I just want to state it was a requirement.
right.
So that's something we can put in our proverbial parking lot.
Right. But let me just double check. I believe the board will, allows us to request claimants to come to New York at our expense. Is that?
I think so.
Is that right?
Does that sound right, Mary Beth?
Request, not necessarily demand.
Right,
Yeah.
but,
You can request it and you have to pay for it.
yeah, that's what I'm saying.
They don't have to.
They don't have to do it.
Can I just add something to that?
Yes, please.
This is Bill Turley in New York City. You know, it is very difficult for claimants to find treating doctors out of state, especially if it is a specialty in an unusual situation. A lot of times, if they all live in close enough, they will travel back to their home base to get treatment, especially if they still have relatives up here. And the other thing too with the IMEs, we just mentioned something about them applying the permanency guidelines. A lot of times you'll get IMEs back from out-of-state doctors and they're using the AMA guidelines, which we don't use. Just an observation.
Happens in state too. It happens in in-state too. There are so many that I see that have the computerized range of motion exams that talk about the percentage of impairment of the total body based on the AMA 6 guidelines, and they do them 3 and 4 times, and I'm always surprised when I look at the billing information, they're all paid for. I don't get that.
Mindy?
No, not to address that issue specifically, but I'm wondering if there's something we couldn't suggest is that in the event that a claimant is still treating regularly in New York, every 3-6 months, that when we want to get an IME, they should be, I don't know if you want to say required, but they should advise us that they will be in New York so that we're able to try to facilitate their having an IME while they're here. If they have, if they have plans otherwise to be here, I think that would not be too onerous and might be extremely helpful.
Can I respond to that? I think it depends on how far the claimant has to travel.
No, I'm saying if they're going to be in New York anyway.
What I'm starting to say was, I think it depends on how far the claimant has to travel and the severity of the injury. Sometimes an injury might be so severe that it prevents them from traveling.
Absolutely. I'm saying in the event that they're coming to New York, that it would be helpful to know that so that we could accommodate them and have the IME here in New York. It's getting a better IME and it accommodates the claimant.
Would you approach that as an obligation of the claimant, like a claimant's obliged to tell you
No.
if he or she returns to work?
No, but I think...
It's just a matter of courtesy?
That's problematic.
Yeah.
You mean as a matter of courtesy?
And I think it, in some way, maybe that's something we can sort of discuss and come to some sort of an agreement on. It doesn't seem to me, again, to be onerous. Maybe there can be some sort of policy implemented, because very often I see a claimant just was at at their own treating doctor a month or so ago here in New York. Now they're somewhere else. So it would have been helpful had we known they were in New York. We would have arranged for the IME at their convenience. I'm not, I'm just trying to say that I think that in those events, it would be to everybody's advantage to move the case forward and get an IME.
Well, I think that most of the time when you're dealing with people out of state, these are people that are post-classification or post-permanency, and usually they're just on treatment issues, sometimes requests for surgery.
I would just say, in this case, we almost never get an IME on treatment issues, so that's not what we're talking about. I'm really talking about an IME. If we need it, we've been directed to get an IME, it would be nice if they're going to be in New York, let us know.
I think that's kind of rare. I think most of the time you find claimants are not going to leave the state until their case comes to a conclusion, unless there are real extenuating circumstances. They're being evicted from their home or something like that.
Okay.
Is there anything else people want to talk about, or think we haven't covered on out-of-state fees? Anyone? Okay, at this point, I think we're going to take a 15-minute break. Okay, is everyone back in their spots? We can get started?
Elaine was getting that, but we can start without.
Okay. All right, Before we took the break, I neglected to see if we had any consensus on our prior topic, or if we want to defer that until maybe we finish up with the IME process schedule. I think we, from the conversation, it seemed like we are going to the board's going to get back to us with additional data, so that may clarify what issues, if any, we have in that category. So at this point, I'd like to welcome all of you who have joined us, the IME entities. There are 3 available here today to discuss the IME process, present their recommendations on how to improve the system, and answer any questions you may have. In Rochester, we have Brookside Consultants, represented by Christy Dorado and Rich Mascarito. Can you say hello and wave? Thank you. In Schenectady, we have ExamWorks Evaluations of New York, represented by Tim Malidi, Andy Gralla, and Crystal Carvada Brown. And NX Consultants, represented by Carol White and Michael Velasek. All right, before we turn it over to the IMEs, I'd like Stephanie to give us a high-level overview of the IME process. And Clarissa wants to add her.
Yes, I just want to add, first of all, thank you so much to the providers, the IME providers that are here today, IME entities. And I do want to remind the committee members that these brave souls have generously volunteered to come before you and share their expertise in this area in order to further the discussion, the very important discussion we're having about IMEs in the system. So just be mindful of that they have come here, taken time out of their own busy schedules and traveled in some cases in order to be of assistance to us. So to the extent possible, we should be as respectful as possible and try and learn as much as we can from them and do more listening than we would otherwise. So just thank you. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Clarissa. The IME process that I will describe is a summary of 55 responses from currently registered IME entities. In April, the board sent a request to all IME entities asking for a detailed description of the steps that they take to schedule an IME from the initial request through submitting the IME report to all parties of interest. Individual steps and timelines may vary slightly from company to company, but the general process is similar for all. The IME process begins with the request for the IME, typically from the carrier. Many carriers use the services of more than one IME. The board does not have information on how the carriers choose which IME entity to which to make the referral. Typically, within 1 business day, the IME entity selects the appropriate medical provider, taking into consideration the required specialty, time frame for scheduling the IME, and distance from the injured worker's residence or work location, and an appointment is made. Typically, again, within a day, the IME 5 notice is sent to all parties of interest to alert them to the date, time, and location of the exam. As you may recall, it must be received by the injured worker at least 7 days prior to the scheduled exam. Some IME entities will also send an injured worker questionnaire with the notice if requested by the carrier or the IME provider, or if it's part of their standard procedure. If the IME exam is not rescheduled at this point, the process continues with the IME entity identifying all parties of interest and compiling medical records, as well as a cover letter and IME 3 form to send to the IME provider for their review. This is typically completed 8 to 10 days before the scheduled IME. Some IME entities perform a second review a few days prior to the IME to make sure that all recent medical reports are captured. If transportation or interpreter services are required, the IME will make the arrangements, IME entity. Approximately 2 to 3 days before the IME, most IME entities will attempt to call the claimant or their representative to remind them of the scheduled IME. some also send a postcard. Starting the day after the scheduled IME, most IME entities will contact the IME provider to confirm that the IME was held and to remind the provider to submit the IME-4 report as soon as possible to meet the 10 business day requirement. Often, several follow-up calls are required. Most IME entities have quality assurance staff who review the submitted IME report to verify that all requested questions were answered. The IME entity then sends the IME-4 report to all parties of interest on the same day and in the same manner. If any issues were identified in quality assurance, the IME entity will notify the carrier and an addendum request may follow. Most IME entities retain copies of medical reports and will assist with setting up depositions if required. As I mentioned, the board sent the IME process request to 73 IME entities who were actively registered in April 2019. We received 55 responses that described the IME process. 7 advised that they no longer, or perhaps have never, performed workers' comp IMEs. Some of these asked to be removed from the listing of registered IME entities. 4 advised that they haven't yet started doing workers' comp IMEs, but plan to do so in the future. We're still following up with 3 IME entities to obtain a full response, and 4 IME entities did not respond at all, which is in conflict with the board's regulation 300.2. So I have some statistics on the IME process that we gathered from the 55 IME entities who responded. 49% will arrange office space. Approximately half of those who arrange office space do so within their own office. The other half will have a leasing arrangement. 42% also provide administrative support on the day of the IME, and approximately half of those who offer administrative support, again, do it within their own office space. 92% will perform call reminders. 96% perform quality assurance on the IME reports. 62% offer transcription services if needed by the IME provider, and most of these are done through outside vendors. 96% will arrange language access services if requested by the carrier. Some carriers contract directly for language access, but if the IME entity some contract directly, but the IME will schedule it. Other times, the IME entity uses their own contracted vendors. And 87% of IME entities will arrange transportation if approved by the carrier. And finally, 27% distribute injured worker questionnaires. The 27% reflects those IME entities that distribute their own questionnaire. It was not counted as a yes if the IME entity merely forwarded a questionnaire at the request of either the carrier or the IME provider. We also asked questions about what was deemed a reasonable distance to schedule the IME. Most IME entities, 41%, advised that they attempt to schedule the IME within the same county where the injured worker resides. 4% had specific urban, suburban, or rural standards. For example, 15 miles urban, 25 miles suburban, or 50 miles rural. 22% attempt to schedule as close as possible, but also have not to exceed standards. For example, a 25-mile radius or a 30-minute drive. And the remaining 33% either did not have a standard or did not disclose it. I will now turn it over to Michelle to introduce the 3 IME entities who are joining us today.
All right, thank you, Stephanie. And before we move off of what you just presented, does anyone on the working group have any questions of Stephanie on the data she collected? Okay. All right, and again, I'd like to echo what Clarissa said, thank you for being here, and giving generously of your time. I think I've already introduced you, so what I'd like to do, I think the format we're thinking of is having each of you do a presentation based on, the IME process as Stephanie outlined, your recommendations on system improvements, and then after each of you have done your presentation, I think it's probably a little bit more productive if we kind of do a roundtable format and people can ask their questions of the three of you all at the same time, rather than jump back and forth. So I think, why don't we start with
Okay.
Jennings.
Yeah. So my name is Mike Valasek. I'm the Vice President of IME Services for Genex. Genex is the second largest provider of IME services on a national basis. We offer a multi-specialty network of board-certified physicians and credentialed physicians of over 25,000 providers on a national basis.
And with you is?
And with me is Carol White. She is our New York branch manager. She oversees the operations in the New York office.
Yep. And I've been working with IMEs for over 24 years now in different capacities and have gone through the process. I have some recommendations here based on what was sent. And some of the ones that we discussed and within my office and with my team and with Michael as well was a workers' comp board training of newly authorized IME providers. We feel that the workers' comp board should have some level of responsibility in ensuring that the quality of the providers' reports are maintained as they are independent from us. I recommend you offer continued medical education for these providers on an ongoing basis in order to ensure that you, the workers' comp board, are authorizing providers who understand the IME purpose and process.
I think our recommendations regarding the program all center around the provider availability and network. As you were discussing a little earlier, there seems to be a declining number of physicians within the state that are willing or know how to perform an IME. And I think the best way to improve that is to increase that availability of doctors.
Is there anything different about the way you do your business from what Stephanie outlined? Is it pretty consistent?
No, that's
it's fairly
consistent model.
Yes.
Any other recommendations?
One other recommendation that we were talking about was to revisit the IME 3 form, perhaps allowing the IME vendor to complete line 10A. Excuse me, it had come up during your earlier conversation about one of the reasons for preclusion is the IME 3. It's to be signed. There's 2 boxes on the IME 3, box 10A and box 10B. 10A, as you know, is to be signed by the provider indicating that they had received a request for information, and that's to be to the board within 10 business days of receipt of the request. Trying to track these down and have them signed by providers and get them back timely is challenging, and that does result in a good number of the preclusions that were referenced earlier. So if we, as the IME vendor, could sign those and indicate that we have in fact received a request for information, that would make the whole process flow a little more efficiently, I think. Yeah.
Did you have any other recommendations that you think would improve the process?
I think it just really centered around the provider availability. Yeah.
And paperwork.
Correct. Yeah.
Okay, mix it up a little. Let's hear from Rochester and the folks from Brookside Consultants.
Good afternoon. My name is Christy Dorado. I am the operations manager at Brookside, and I'm here with Rick Mascarito, the president of the company. We have been arranging workers' comp IMEs since 2002. We currently arrange IMEs for numerous TPAs and insurance carriers nationwide, servicing New York State-driven claims. Our primary focus since inception has been New York State workers' comp IME services. And we were founded in 2002, incorporated in New York State by President and CEO Rick Mascarito. The company has never been involved in any acquisitions, divestitures, or ownership changes since our inception. So that's just a little bit of a background for us. In terms of the overall IME process that was given by Stephanie, there's only 2 items that really are pretty minor, the no-show process. So if the claimant does indeed show for the exam, the end result is going to be the IME report narrative. On the other end of things, if the claimant does no-show, the process involved with that would be to mail a no-show letter to all parties of interest, as well as contacting the insurers to gain authorization to go ahead and reschedule that appointment. So once that authorization is received, we would then reschedule the IME for the next available date. In addition to that, Brookside has an IME3 process outside of our IME report process. The IME3 form has kind of been a little bit of a gray area for a while in terms of how to process the form properly. The regulations state that it is 10 days. So because it doesn't distinguish between calendar or business days, we always go by the assumption that it is calendar days. So there is a separate process outside of the report where we collect the IME3 form signed by the IME provider, and then that is sent with the IME cover letter to the workers' comp board. But outside of those, the process pretty much coincides with what our IME process is. Do you want me just to go into the 5 items? Sure. Okay. The first one would be documentation upload into eCase, the turnaround time for that. We are suggesting that the board look into the possibility of improving this. Right now, it seems to kind of teeter between 3 to 5 business days. And in order to maintain an accurate depiction of what is contained in that file, we suggest that it be somewhere around the 2 to 3 business day range, especially because for hearings, the IME report should really be enclosed in eCase 3 business days prior. It'll also help avoid the unwarranted litigation for IME reports and other records that were sent to the board on a timely basis, but they were just simply inaccessible due to the fact that they weren't scanned in timely. So improving this would actually go hand in hand with our next suggestion, which is a slight change in the same time, same manner. We agree with the panel that same time should definitely be adhered to, but it's the same manner that doesn't typically reflect any updates in technological advances that we've had. We're suggesting that the board possibly allow the ability for the IME entities to upload the report directly into eCase so that it's immediately received by all parties and available for everyone to consider. It would be considered the primary report, and all parties of interest would then have their logins or whatever method you guys choose to have it available for all of them. We do also agree that the claimant should still receive a paper copy, even if they're represented and if they're not. We think that that should still be mailed, but to be able to upload the document directly into the WCB would definitely make things go a lot faster. It would also make sure that everyone, regardless of address changes, we have a ton of return mail that comes in, especially from treating providers that we CC. It would help deflect a little bit of that return mail that comes in to ensure that all parties do truly receive a copy of the report. The third item that we have is some consistencies in the timelines throughout the process. It would benefit to have consistency amongst either everything being calendar days or everything being business days. Many of the deadlines are inconsistent and cause confusion for IME entities as well as providers and carriers. A couple of examples, like I had mentioned earlier, the IME3 versus the IME4. The IME4 is 10 business days, whereas the IME3 is 10 calendar days. So due to this, we've had some provider confusion in terms of what they're supposed to send to us at what point. I did label some other forms in our detailed outline. I don't know if you guys have those available, but for example, the IME5 is business days. And in addition to having this consistency, it would also be beneficial to exclude holidays on report form or deadlines. Chances are if there's a request for treatment or surgery in, say, around mid-December, oftentimes it's difficult to schedule a live exam with the Christmas holiday and the New Year's holiday enclosures, as well as no mail being processed on either of those days as well. It wouldn't provide too much of an extension on a deadline, but it would give, an extension so that it could increase the ability for us to give notice to the claimant for these rush exams, as that tends to be an issue as well, is we would prefer not to waive a claimant's notice to attend an IME, so giving a little bit more time for those types of requests would benefit the ability to give them the notice. Piggybacking off of that is the C4 Auth MG2 form deadlines. The overall process has very strict timeframes that must be adhered to. Initially, the claimant needs to have an IME 5 appointment letter. We go for mailing it out 12 business days, since in New York it tends to take 5 business days to get to any party anywhere in the state. So to allow them to receive that notice within the 7 business day threshold, we mail them out on business day 12. Then once the IME takes place, you have 10 business days for the provider to submit the written report to the vendor that is then distributed to all parties. If you're taking those 2 deadlines into account, you've already used 22 business out of the 30 allotted for those types of requests. So with that, there are things that happen with waiving the claimant's notice, such as they can't attend due to taking time off from work that quickly, they have conflicting appointments that they can't miss, and just the lack of notice in general is an issue for many claimants with the rush exams. In an effort to push these and to push rush IMEs and strict turnaround exams to providers, a 45 calendar day deadline we feel would be a little bit more appropriate. It would allow the claimant to make the necessary arrangements to be able to attend, and then they'll receive the proper IME notice to plan accordingly. The last item we have is in regards to videotaping. Under the current regulations, a claimant may videotape an exam without any prior notice to the IME physician, but the physician may do so only with notice. They have to note that on the IME 5 form. This can cause IME doctors to simply give notice when they have no intention to videotape, since they don't know whether or not the claimant will intend to do so. We suggest that the verbiage in the IME 5 be revised so that both the claimant and the IME physician be permitted to videotape without prior notice. And then this will likely reduce the incidences of videotaping exams and reduce the possibility of a tense relationship, between the claimant and the IME physician. It'll also encourage physicians who have been reluctant in the past to perform exams to potentially think about doing them again. And those are our 5 items.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Sandworks?
Yep. So my name is Tim Malidi. My role with the company is I oversee ExamWorks business operations nationally, as well as New York. I'm based in the Boston market, but I've been working in the New York market for approximately 25 years. I brought with me today, when I heard when we first heard that this meeting was, this committee was convened and it was shifting in direction about asking opinions and constructive items from the industry, we basically raised our hand. Happy to be here today. I brought with me Mandy Grella. I view Mandy as somebody that is basically a subject matter expert in the New York workers' comp space. She's been processing New York workers' comp IMEs for 24, 25 years. So Mandy can chime in accordingly with questions and everything that we heard from this morning. So I've also brought Crystal Cavada-Brown. Crystal is a nurse that works with me, again, in the Boston area. She has oversight of all of our quality and physician initiatives. So the physician panel sits under Crystal as far as all regulatory issues and compliance issues and credentialing issues. So by way of background, ExamWorks is the largest IME company in New York, we believe, as well as nationally and internationally. We operate in Canada, the UK, Australia as well. Again, when this meeting was convened or was brought up, we thought we were definitely the subject matter experts here, because I think things have come up of late about other states, other venues, and that's the perspective that we think we bring to the table here today. So definitely willing to answer any questions about who, what, how, positive, negatives, fee schedules, things of that nature, anything that comes up. So our recommendations. One of the items that keeps coming up, or when we first started to view these meetings, or the content of these meetings, was the initial drop in some of the physicians that were performing IMEs that fell out of the system, so to speak. And we felt like we would be remiss if we didn't just mention the fees associated with it. We'll pivot here in a moment to another, 4 or 5 other recommendations that speak to the process. But in sitting here this morning or earlier, New York is a very unique environment. You have it's very there's a tremendous amount of work that goes into the IME associated with the physician. Forms that were just referenced, the tight turnaround times that are referenced, potential preclusion issues that all fall on the shoulders of the physician or the facilitator. It doesn't necessarily attract physicians. You're not driving doctors that want to do IMEs on the side to potentially supplement their income, and you're certainly not attracting the doctors that I think the carriers, the TPAs, the self-insureds, anybody wants to necessarily use because of the workflow, which we'll get into in just a moment. The other component of that is the reimbursement, though. New York, based on the fact that it is such a large state, there's a lot of volume. We've seen that the fees, the recommended reimbursement for the doctors has remained shallow over the years as compared to other states. We don't think that a fee schedule is needed, but it's just something that, to be cognizant of the typical reimbursement, New York is on the shallow end of reimbursement for IME providers. I think your data is reflective of that. We would concur with that. We have data that supports that. We've also looked at the IAIBC data as well, and I think that there's consensus in that regard. So with that, I think very similar to what Brookside had just given an overview on, I'll turn it over to Mandy Grella associated with some of the other technical items.
Yeah, so one of the things that we're seeing is the biggest complaint from physicians are the paperwork burden. They feel that there's way too many forms for them to complete for each exam. So right now, if there's an IME, they're completing an IME 3, an IME 4, a 4.3A or B, depending on what questions are being asked. I think we would just like to make a recommendation to maybe consider merging the forms. If the 4A or 4.3 is needed, maybe include some of the items on the other forms so there's only one form for a provider to complete. This could potentially attract physicians that have contacted us stating that, there's too much work, we don't want to, do these exams anymore. Again, similar to what they said, the strict turnaround times, the 10 days, I know seems to be a sufficient amount of time, but if a physician is going on vacation or if he's on hospital duty rounds or, anything in his treating practice, it could prevent him from getting that report timely. We spend a lot of time following up with the physicians to get them to adhere to those guidelines. So if the preclusion rate is low, it's probably because, all the IME entities hounding the physicians to get it. Recommendation, if possible, that 20-day rule that you have for out-of-state physicians, I think, that would be a fair time frame. It's obviously not hindering the out-of-state claimants for their injured worker time. It's a matter of if the 20 days could get more reports back sooner. I actually had written down here the challenge for the 30 days for the MG2 C4 auths, exactly what she indicated. We're finding that with the business days, we really only have 2 to 3 days to schedule that appointment. So if you're contacting the workers' comp authorized physicians and you're asking who has an appointment within that 2 to 3 day time period, a lot of times those cases end up having to turn into workers' comp record reviews. If they extended that time frame, more IMEs could take place instead of record reviews. Another thing to consider would be extending the time frames for performing exams. I know right now it's 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. Monday through Friday. If we would consider maybe 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. or even including Saturdays, a treating physician would have the ability to open up a session on a Saturday, which could get the appointments, seen sooner. And videotape, I know that's probably the biggest complaint from our physicians. A lot of them are, I do not want to, be videotaped because, years ago when it first came out, we hired a videographer to do it, and there was a counter on it. Now everybody's walking around with cell phones. They walk into an exam, they're hiding their cell phones. The doctors just feel like it's not fair. They should have this same, they should know ahead of time if it's going to be videotaped, so they could be prepared and videotape also. So if that videotape does come out, at least they're able to show their copy of their videotape and know that there was no alterations done to it.
Do you have any recommendations you wanted to add?
No.
Okay.
no.
All right. So we have the group that is here in person, and then we have several questions that were asked in advance of the meeting today. And so why don't we open it up to the group first? And in advance of doing any questions, to the extent you're asked a question, if you feel uncomfortable in any way, if you think something's proprietary, by all means share. If you don't know the information and you need to get back to us, share that with us too. We do want to keep the conversation going and be as productive as possible. So for the group, for Rochester, does Rochester have any questions of the panel that is here to discuss the IME process?
Yes, I want to know how
And before we start, for all of their benefit, if you could again identify yourself.
Sure.
And where you're from, so they know. Thank you.
Sure. Brian from Wegmans, I have a question for anybody that does out-of-state IMEs, how they compare in process and administration to what we had to deal with in New York. And that's probably a better question maybe for ExamWorks or Genix. I think Brookside just does New York. So.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. It is, we don't think that the process in New York is broken. We don't think that, you need to overhaul the IME process, but you need to be cognizant, and it's a great way to frame the question, of the administrative. It's incredibly laborious. The process is incredibly laborious compared to border states, compared to states on the other side of the country. I can't think of another state. I work in every state. I'm familiar with the process in every state. I can't think of a state that's more laborious with regard to forms, process procedures, tight time frames, punitive damages than New York. As far as, and then there's just a tremendous amount of language as to how the records are procured, who, how, what, where. I know that was brought up by, I think, one of the physicians that's in the committee here. New York you have your own dialect here. You have your own dialect as compared to the rest of the country. Even when there was a question pointed out about impairment ratings and treat, things like that. Yep, you're a standalone nation here. So when you have somebody, a physician or a claimant or an injured worker that might have moved from point A to point B, you're typically seeing, that the doctors aren't familiar with it because doctors don't speak New York dialect. And even the doctors that live here don't want to necessarily learn New York workers' comp dialect because it is, getting back to the fee component, it is lower in reimbursement on average compared to border states or any other parts of the U.S. So it's laborious, the forms are laborious, the process is laborious as compared to the process in other states.
And plus, you have to realize that these physicians are doing this work to supplement their income. It's not their primary source of income. So to make it more challenging and difficult on them, they're less willing to perform the IMEs.
Yeah, and again, we're not. I know how this might appear. We're not here to say you need to raise the fees or anything like that. It's an open economy. It's an open market. It's just you need to be cognizant of the doctors that want to shift into this as a secondary line of income potentially. And just comprehend that it's not the most attractive secondary line of income to the physicians. So,
Can I just ask a question? Does anybody here do claims for no fault and tort claims?
Yep.
Can you describe if there's a substantive difference in those IMEs, price, fee, how they're used, et cetera?
Yep. So the forms, I don't know, Mandy, you might,
There are no forms.
there are no
for the
forms.
doctor
So
to
you
complete.
eliminate all of that dialect that I basically spoke of. There are no extra forms involved. It's much similar to some of the border states where the doctors.
There's no time frame requirements.
Yep. Yep, all of those aforementioned issues, timelines, punitive damages for precluded reports, all of that is out the window. And that is actually one of the issues that has developed here, is that, generally speaking, not to get off into too much of a tangent here, but generally speaking, workers' comp examinations, IME physicians that perform IMEs in the other 49 states gravitate more towards performing workers' comp evaluations in those states than they do no-fault or liability cases, especially in states that have no-fault. They gravitate more towards workers' comp. In New York, it's the opposite because of the process and procedure, just generally speaking.
What about the fees? Similar?
Nope. Do you want to speak to the fees? I mean, the no-shows, the no-show piece, that's something that, that we didn't have that as a talking point, but I heard that come up earlier. It's something that if the doctor is allotting their time, they want to be reimbursed. A lot of the, yep, I'm sorry.
Meant between the tort IME and workers' comp.
Yeah, so first party.
Liability probably.
Yeah. So
liability pays more.
Yeah, liability exams with high exposure cases, we're pre-negotiating rates, and because of the exposure of that case, the physician is reimbursed a lot more, so it's not an issue. The no-fault reimbursement is a lot more commensurate with workers' comp in New York. It's because of a lot of the companies that perform this work, and some of the customers actually write multiple lines as well. So they're negotiating that, and if they're cognizant that, well, they only pay you X amount of dollars for a workers' comp exam, why would I be paying you that much more for a no-fault exam? So the fee reimbursement is somewhat similar in that regard on the first-party work in New York.
Clarification question. Who negotiates the price with the physician who's doing the IME? Is that the carrier, the self-insured employer, or the IME entity, or a combination thereof?
So,
it could be anybody.
So the carrier is negotiating, generally speaking, the carrier, the requesting party in this case, is negotiating the price with either the physician directly, if there is no IME entity involved, or with the IME entity, whether that be through an RFP, whether that be through just negotiation. So they negotiate a rate with us, and then we're subsequently negotiating a rate with the doctor as well, behind the scenes.
So, I mean, with making an assumption that a lot of self-insured employers and a lot of insurance companies are doing business both in New York and outside of New York and are having these experiences.
Yep.
Where do you see, where does anybody who does this nationally see, why are we different? I mean, it's the same, in a lot of cases, it's the same entities.
Yeah. Yeah, it's
doing this negotiation.
It's
right.
The history is that you're as cases as work is renegotiated. New York has always been at the lower end. I can't speak to why the reimbursement for the desired reimbursement for a workers' comp orthopedic, and it's we'll generalize things as orthopedic. 85% of all the transactions are orthopedic in nature. Over the years, what's happened is, and again, I live in Massachusetts, so New York and Massachusetts were very similar as far as reimbursement for an orthopedic exam, an IME orthopedic exam. Over the years, Massachusetts, as RFPs, as negotiation comes up from time to time with the referral source, we have increased our rate because the doctors have increased their rates. In New York, because of the massive volume, and that's what it is, it boils down to, there's no other state like New York. I mean, there's California, but that's a whole different system. There's no other state like New York that has so much volume concentrated in particular areas, so the consumer is able to negotiate and continue to mandate a lower rate for reimbursement or charge. So we've continued to go along with those rates basically, and then it's catching up a little bit. It's catching up. It's the fact that now there are doctors that aren't willing to necessarily participate, and to superimpose on that with Chapter 137, with the additional regs that have been added over the years that didn't exist 20 years ago, we've made it more complicated for the doctor. We've made it more,
Right, I think if it was still just the fees that we've had in place for so many years.
It wouldn't be such an issue.
It wouldn't be such an issue, except that we've added a lot more work for them to do along with that.
And I don't mean to make it all about fees. It really is. It's all of the aforementioned issues that the folks from Brookside and that Mandy mentioned that superimposed on the reimbursement, it's not an attractive lifestyle.
I have a follow-up on the recommended reimbursement. is the source of that the RFP and the negotiation between IME entity and carrier, customer?
Typically.
Or is there some other source for that recommendation?
No, that's typically, that's basically it in a nutshell. That's
And it's
basically
all supply and demand. You know, the insurance carriers are wanting to pay less, the doctors are wanting paid more, so it's kind of meeting in the middle.
Okay.
Yep.
I don't want to jump in front of my friend Brian Trick if he had more questions.
I do have one more, and then you can take over, Lev.
No, I don't want to take over. Go ahead.
It's come up in previous discussions here that we're looking at a provider access issue for IMEs. We also talk about an idea of only having treating providers do IMEs, which I think those two concepts conflict. What does any of the IME entities think about with having retired doctors doing IMEs? We at Wegmans tend to like it because they're more flexible, and I think they have more time. So those are my personal thoughts, but I want to hear from IME entities about your thoughts versus retired doctors versus currently treating doctors.
Yeah, look, and I'll defer to Crystal a little bit on this, but I think that generally speaking, we understand the perception that if a physician is of a certain age and has been removed from an operating room for X amount of years or things like that, we understand, we get it. We're not trying to recruit doctors that don't depose well, that don't present well. We understand that this is your it's needed on the claim. However, I think that there's a fine line associated with what is the cutoff, what is the description of that. An orthopedic surgeon that's been performing surgery for 30 years or so, that if he just stops, because of the cost of med mal, just has decided I'm not going to cut any longer, I'm not going to be in the OR any longer, that the next day that doctor should be precluded from, doing an independent medical exam. We don't see any logic behind that. So I don't know, Crystal, if you have any thoughts on that.
And a lot of older physicians step away from performing surgery because of their own arthritic hands. So, just because they're no longer cutting a patient anymore doesn't mean that they don't still have that knowledge from 30 or 35 years of performing IMEs. And, I guess the question is, where is that cutoff point? Is it, if somebody retires tomorrow, all of the knowledge that was in their head didn't just evaporate, so there's a period of time, at least for someone who's not practicing, where they're still considered, current to do this work.
And it can be challenging to meet the report deadlines. If you have a busy orthopedic practice and they're doing lots of surgeries, it's very difficult to get the reports.
Yep.
Because Brian Trick literally took the question right out of my mouth. But to follow up on that, do we need a cutoff? Because, someone practices until they're 70 or 65 or whatever it is, and then they start doing some IMEs, or they start doing more IMEs, however we want to put that. Wouldn't the market, as you all described the process, dictate that if that person no longer presents well, no longer can offer testimony, no one's going to use them ever again, or her ever again, right?
Absolutely.
A line would be somewhat arbitrary. Someone's performance can be of significant value until they're far older than where we might set up.
Correct, and I think the other relevant fact here is that we perform work for a lot of large customers, large TPAs, insureds, carriers, and they, what I've seen in the development here over the years is that it used to be that you have an insurance adjuster that might not be the most medically trained person in the world facilitating the request for an IME. That doesn't happen in 2019. By the time an IME is typically requested, it's gone through a process and procedure on the carrier side, where it's gone through a nurse or a medical director and things of that nature. So I think that they're their own best judge as to what they want, how they want an exam done. Do they want a physiatrist? Do they want an orthopedic surgeon? Here are the issues, those types of things. I don't think that we need to step in and kind of govern, and they'll be their own best judge, basically. We hear doctors that are on the workers' comp board approved list, which is where we retrieve our physicians from. that if they don't present well, if there's something that is something off from a deposition standpoint, we'll look into that, and we'll, move away from utilizing that physician in the future, because if the consumer doesn't want to utilize the physician, there's nothing I can really do or say about that.
Can I just make a comment? It's Rick Weinstein. I'm an orthopedic surgeon in a very busy orthopedic practice, and I also do IME exams. So as the only orthopedist who does this on this panel, I think it's important for us to identify what the real issue is. I do work with ExamWorks and GenX and a bunch of other companies, and I have a very good relationship with those companies. My concern is the doctors who are hired hitmen, and we've talked about this in previous discussions. The doctors who, no matter what, will deny treatment, or the doctors who will absolutely say the person's completely incapacitated, depending on who's hiring them. I find in Westchester, where I practice, a lot of the doctors who are what I'm calling hitmen, who just put in the report whatever they're told to put in the report, tend to be not really practicing physicians. And I agree that you should not be forced to not do IMEs the day you retire, but I do think 3 years or 5 years out, there's got to be some kind of new accreditation, or just saying you can't be 5 years out of practice and doing that. So that's my opinion, because when I see these IMEs from doctors, we've said in previous meetings, when you see a doctor's name, certain doctors will give you the same report every time, so you know what they're going to say before they even see the claimant.
Just one more thing about the doctors. I know you brought up about doctors should be treating doctors also. I think what we find is on the workers' comp website, and I'll use Brooklyn as an example, Kings County, there are 70 doctors that are authorized to treat. There are only 28 authorized to do IMEs. And out of those 28, 10 of them either aren't accepting cases or can't be used for turnaround time reasons. Mm-hmm. So the criteria is different for, if you want your authorization number to treat, they're not required to be ABMS or AOS certified, but they are if they're doing IMEs. Mm-hmm. So I think we have a smaller pool to deal with than the treating side.
I think that makes sense, and whoever brought up the point that the paperwork is killing us could not be more dead on. Paperwork is a horrible thing when it's burying us. It takes longer than the actual examinations.
And it's only increased in nature in the last X amount of years. So.
But would it work for you if the paperwork was merged, so the information was all on one form for you to complete?
If it was less paperwork overall, so I don't care if it's 3 pages long or 1 page long, the less I have to do, the better it is.
I'd like to jump in on that one. The reason we went to this, or the reason that I saw this happening, was because doctors would submit their reports to the IME clearinghouses, and the reports would morph. They may not reflect what it was that the primary source had submitted, and we had evidence of it. We saw the reports that the doctor's office had sent, and they said, I never said these things. So in order to address that, the forms were generated, and the very tight timelines came on. But one of the things that the board wisely did is now have e-filing. If a physician who is preparing the report would upload that report directly, it's then available to everyone, and I did like the statement about in the same manner to everyone, but if it's uploaded, great. Mm-hmm. That way the concern that one has about the language being used, and I heard the word boilerplate, they will say the same thing, and we're aware of that. I believe that would change it a lot and make it much easier for the doc, and you wouldn't need a form. That's why the other systems don't require them, because no one touches them.
On that question, this is a question for the board, really, and I guess we could answer it later, or we could parking lot it. So things like direct upload, are we talking about a technological hindrance that is standing in our way, which every app on my phone has this possibility already, so it can't be that big of a hindrance? Or are we talking about regulatory or even legislative hindrances? Statutory.
I've done it for a few months.
And this, but it would be same time, same manner, right?
It would be viewable on e-case to
by everyone at the
all
same
that has
time in the
access.
same manner.
Right, but we dealt a meeting or two ago with claimants who don't have internet access.
I was doodling at that time.
And the idea that those claimants should still receive a copy by mail.
I heard somebody say we
Yeah.
could still mail
It's
to
being
a
included.
claimant, which wouldn't be the same manner, to your point, but.
Right.
So legislative is the answer to
So,
that.
yeah, it's
Yeah.
the same time, same manner hurdle that. yeah.
But forms are not legislative, correct?
That's right.
And videotaping, that issue that I've heard from, I think, all three groups, is that?
Regulatory.
Regulatory. Okay, that's all I needed. Thanks.
I have several questions.
Okay. And just to add, Brookside, if you want to add to anything, please feel free to do so. Hope you don't feel left out.
Thank you.
My questions are to all of the IME entities, anyone who cares to answer. What is the source of the records that you provide to your IME?
Yep, we heard it mentioned. Mandy, you
Yes,
wanna-
so in our office, what we do is most of our carriers, probably 90% at this point in time, have given us party of interest to eCase. So we go on and we upload all the eCase medical records from the medical record tab into our system to provide the physicians with.
Okay. So you're not receiving them from the requester of the IME?
Very few.
Very few.
Very few. Most of it has turned over. We've tried over the years to get party of interest access only because this way we know we're giving the doctor exactly what's on eCase. So again, we know there's no preclusions.
Okay. And is it the same with Gen X?
It is, yeah.
Same with Brookside?
Yes, we tend to print a high volume from eCase directly, but we do have multiple clients that do not grant us that access. One item that was released was duplicate filing of medical records, so not having eCase access can be really difficult for IME entities because the IME physicians, whatever they're supplied at the time of the IME must be contained in the eCase file prior to the doctor seeing the patient. So when we don't have eCase access, it can be very difficult to ensure that everything has been filed properly before the exam takes place.
Which opens the door for potential preclusions later. Yeah.
Correct.
Okay. So, and in that process of getting the records from eCase, do you have any practice or policy about excluding certain records?
So
No.
we don't.
Okay.
The only thing that we will remove out are cover sheet pages, things that are non-medical
Yeah.
in nature.
Fact sheets.
Okay.
things
Right,
Duplicates.
fax cover
Duplicates.
sheets or attorney notes that are, non-medical that may have been put in eCase.
And you mentioned downloading the materials on the medical tab.
Correct.
Now, it's not as prevalent on the medical tab as it is on the decisions tab, but sometimes those documents are not properly coded in the board file. So there could be something that is a medical report that isn't coded as a medical report and therefore doesn't appear on the medical tab. Do you have any process to capture those records?
So we're not going into all tabs to review, but if a carrier lets us know that there's something in one of the other tabs, they'll usually identify the form number and the date,
Same.
and we'll pull it
Okay.
from there.
Communication from the
So
carrier.
by document ID, you would find out
Yeah.
from your client?
That there were priors or something that they wanted included, yes.
Okay. Moving away from records, how do you recruit the IMEs that are on your panels?
Recruit the IME
The physician?
The physicians, yes.
Yep, so.
They're workers' comp board authorized doctors, so the release came out yesterday, and I'm sure we all
Okay.
went running to look to see if anybody was on our panel, not on the panel.
Yeah.
Okay, so you rely on the board's authorization to, for
Right.
IMEs to
If-
reach out to those
Yeah,
doctors?
I mean, if we have a physician on our panel that's not workers' comp board authorized, we'll try to encourage them to become authorized. Some of them choose not to because they would rather not do comp work.
Mhm.
Some of them apply and are waiting for their authorization number.
Okay.
Yep. We spend, I think I speak for all the vendors here, we spend a tremendous amount of money recruiting physicians all across the country, but in particular in New York, we spend an ungodly amount of money trying to recruit doctors.
Because the need is there.
The need is there, yep.
Okay. So, and now the last three questions I have, I'm sort of going to morph into a devil's advocate and maybe challenging my colleague Joe Canvas, who had to leave the meeting. Do you exercise any influence over the questions that are asked of the IME?
Nope.
Absolutely not.
Where do those questions come from?
They come from the carrier.
Okay. Do you exercise any influence over the answers to those questions?
Nope.
No,
As is
absolutely
law,
not.
everything's got to go out in the same manner that it was received. So if a doctor does or doesn't answer a question, that report has to go.
That report goes, and it's your client that alerts you if a question they asked was not answered?
So it depends on, the specific client. If we have a blanket to act on their behalf, when we're reading the report, if a question wasn't addressed, then we'll complete the IME 3 form with what question's going to be asked, and those are attached to the report that goes out as is to all parties. So the claimant and everybody sees exactly, here's the report, and here's what was missed, and this is what we're asking the doctor for.
Okay, and the last question I have is, are any of you aware of a blacklist that contains the names of doctors who are not to be used as IMEs?
You want me to answer this?
Sure.
So, blacklist, no. Are there some specific physicians that I choose not to use for reasons like I know that turnaround time is bad, and therefore the report's not going to come back timely and it's going to be precluded and I'm going to have to eat that money? That doctor would be on a list that I knew not to be used because his turnaround time, or if a physician, the report comes back and he can't address like a SLU or permanency rating because he just doesn't understand the guidelines, same thing. But other than that, you know what? There's limited physicians. If they can give us that appointment, we're trying to book those appointments as soon as we can.
Thank you.
Some of the questions that were emailed to us actually kind of follow on the same, topic. Credentialing processes, what are they, to the extent you
Yep.
have.
Happy to take that. So ExamWorks is a URAC accredited company. I think the other folks here are as well. URAC, if you're not familiar with who they are, they're a Washington, D.C. based nonprofit organization that came about in 1994, originally to sort of police health plans that were making utilization review decisions. So they were looking to make sure that the health plan wasn't approving treatment for one patient and denying it for another patient with, back in the day, decisions were sometimes arbitrary and capricious. So that was URAC's initial mission. Over the years, they've developed other standards for, IROs and, health companies and workers' comp companies and IME companies now. URAC requires that we credential our doctors every 3 years. So we actually tighten that time frame. We do it every 2 years. We also re-credential. If we credential a doctor today and his New York license expires 3 months from now, we don't wait 2 years to go back and look at that New York license to make sure it's updated. So we also do it upon expiration of any given credential. What we look for when we credential doctors is all of their medical licenses in every state that they're licensed in. We primary source verify that information. So we don't take a copy from the physician, here's a copy of my license, here's a copy of my board cert. We go to if he's licensed in 10 states, we go to the 10 different states' medical licensing boards and we obtain primary source verification of the license. What also goes along with that is primary source verification to make sure they don't have any sanctions or disciplinary actions, either current or historical, on their licenses. We primary source verify their board certification either with the American Board of Medical Specialties or the AOA, American Osteopathic Association. And we also enroll each physician into what's called the National Practitioner Data Bank. And the NPDB gives us information about doctors. It's sort of a double check on what we can get from the board. So it tells us if they've had licensure issues before, if they've had board certification issues before, but also if they've lost clinical privileges in a hospital setting, or if a health plan has said we no longer will keep you in our network for whatever reason, or if they've been disbarred from Medicare or Medicaid programs. So we get a whole host of information from the National Practitioner Data Bank as well. And that's, in addition to those items, then we also ensure that the doctor's on the work comp board authorized list. So there's kind of a all-encompassing. And I'm sure there's anything else you'd add from Genix or Brookside.
Similar flow, yeah.
No, you covered it.
And another question that is related is, now we understand, how it is you credential those that you're relying on internally, inter-examiner, reliability testing and training. What processes do you have in place to ensure that that is adequately being used?
So I can take that.
Yeah.
So the IRR, inter-rater reliability or inter-examiner reliability, I guess it's sort of morphed into here. That is typically something that we see in the world of utilization reviews. So a health plan, they want to make sure that if a patient comes forward and wants a knee arthroscopy, that we don't have Dr. A looking at that knee arthroscopy and denying it, and then the patient appeals it, and then it's given to Dr. B on appeal, and Dr. B suddenly approves it. So we need to look at that and see, what was the difference? Given no additional clinical information, why are these two physicians having a disconnect on that opinion? Why did one approve it and one deny it? A little bit different in the IME world. Those records they tend to be voluminous, but Dr. A might see an examinee today, and he might note that examinee out in the waiting room spinning around in his chair, or maybe clicking his feet when he walks in the door, and then Dr. B might see that same claimant a month or two later, that same injured worker, and see a completely different picture. So they're actually getting a live person that they can look at to help them make their recommendations in those IME reports. Whereas in the traditional IRR environment, it's 20 sheets of medical records, no patient to look at, and it's just making a decision on those records that are in front of you. So the IME physician has the benefit of seeing a patient in front of him or her, so it's really tough to do that IRR in the IME world.
Yeah. So we have those processes in place on the peer side. This isn't something we've ever delved into on the IME examiner side.
Can I ask what I hope it's not a loaded question, but there seems to be an impression that doctors either believe or are told, or IME companies believe or are told, that in order to continue to do business, they are to give reports that are necessarily favorable to the carrier or the insurer, or rather the employer. And I know from my own experience with the City of New York, we explicitly tell all our IME companies we want the absolute best, most truthful report possible. But in your experience as IME companies, have you ever had that, and is there any reason to believe that that is true? Because it's a commonly held belief.
Yep, we've heard it. We get it. We hear it. We hear the innuendo that's made associated with this. But from a policy, from a procedure, from a workflow, that is not part of our DNA. I think I speak for the other companies that are here. I can't speak. There have been companies over the years that have folded up shop overnight. And that are not in the industry any longer. I can't speak to the black eye that might have given to the industry and the legacy and the rumor and innuendo. But procedurally, there is nothing that takes place associated with us communicating, strong-arming, anything with the doctor. There's plenty of work in the state of New York. There's plenty of work in the state of New York. With good process and procedures, that's what we're looking for repeat business. By doing that, we'll get business, coming back at us. We do not communicate with the doctor as far as the not the quality, but the content or anything like that. We just want the doctor to answer the questions so that the customer will be happy with the doctor's report and not say, that doctor never seems to answer any of the questions, and I have to get an addendum every time I use that doctor. It filters the doctors out, basically. It's a natural progression, basically, but there's nothing coming from us, the IME entity, that has any influence in that regard.
And you also have to remember with the medical treatment guidelines and the SLU and permanency, it's all there in black and white. I mean, the exam has to equate to the outcome. It's not something that, should be swayed.
I think that's Brookside.
The folks of New York, do you have a question?
I have a question. Can you just, this is for Gen X, you're up there in Schenectady, right? Gen X?
Yes.
Okay. Could you tell us how the report actually gets generated? So the claimant goes through his exam, the doctor does the exam. What happens after that?
The doctor typically will dictate their report and into their transcription, and then the report is sent out to all parties.
So he dictates the report and he generates the actual written report?
Yes.
Okay, and then he sends the copies to the carrier and the parties?
He sends the report to our office for review. We have a quality review team.
That's what, yeah, could you tell me
Yes.
how that works?
So we receive the report from the provider and we review it for content and typos, things of that nature, and send it along. If there are typos, if there are missed questions, anything of that nature, we, advise the carrier of same, asking, is this something that you want addressed in an addendum? We wait for their direction on that, and then we send the report to all parties of interest.
So the doctor sends you the report and you review it for content. You don't go back to the doctor and say, what did you mean by this, or?
No, because we can't, no. The report has to go out as is. We just try to capture anything that may be of an issue for our customer.
It's more of a courtesy to our customer to give
Correct.
them a heads up, look, the doctor didn't address this issue in the report, and then we go back and request an addendum.
Okay, but you don't change the report and send it out, it goes out as is?
Right, correct.
Okay.
I heard two different things, and tell me when I fell asleep. The first thing I heard was the doctor calls up and dictates it, and then we send the report out. And then I heard the woman next to you say, the doctor prepares the report, forwards it to us, and then we look at it. They're very different, because what was missing from the dictation was having it returned to the doctor for proofreading by that physician who dictated it, and to have eyes on to see if that is indeed what that doctor said.
Oh.
And the other one, sending in typos and the ugly warts and all, which is how reports tend to be when doctors prepare them, are very different. So which one is it?
Well, most
Maybe both.
physicians have their own transcription. They either utilize a company or they employ transcriptionists. So most of the physicians are sending us a completed report, and then we are sending it out to all parties.
So then you're changing what you said before. Was
No, that is what he said before.
Then I was asleep for that. Because most doctors don't use transcription services anymore, so I was interested to hear that.
But you never do any of the transcription?
Do I ever do? No, I don't do any of the
They
transcription.
don't, okay, I mean, your company, I mean, you don't do any of the transcription?
No, we don't have transcription.
Right.
Okay, so the doctor sends you the actual report?
Thank you.
Correct.
Correct.
I'm still a little confused about the corrections, though.
Well, there are no corrections. We just review it for content so that we can advise our customer if there are any potential issues.
So would the report still go out as is, let's say with grammatical errors, mistakes?
Absolutely, yep.
Shows all that.
Absolutely.
Okay. All right,
All the
that's
warts,
fine.
all the, yes, exactly, yep.
Okay.
Yeah, we just review it as a courtesy, and if we find those, we do alert the customer of same, asking if they want clarifications or any changes to let us know, and we'll request an addendum.
From the doctor.
Is that essentially how you do it at Brookside as well?
Correct. And we, kind of piggybacking a little bit earlier, one had mentioned that there are certain contracts in place with clients where we are able to immediately request an addendum for any of those errors noticed, whereas most other clients, they're emailed and then we get the authorization in writing from them to move forward with whatever addendum information that they need.
Yes, just as ExamWorks had indicated, if we have the right to act on the client's behalf, then we certainly will request the addendum and get the clarification necessary from the physician.
But it doesn't stop the process of the IME
The
going
report
out to
still
all,
goes out.
all parties.
The report still
as
goes
is.
out.
Correct.
Okay.
Thank you.
White Plains, did you have any questions of the IME providers that are here today?
No specific questions, but I think we brought up another topic, which I don't know if we want to address. The carriers who do have a dictation service makes it much easier for the doctors. So if we're looking to get more orthopedists and doctors in general involved in IMEs, it's another step that we have to do is get our own dictation service or type it ourselves or dictate it ourselves. Makes it more difficult. If we were offered a dictation service by the carriers or by the service, then it would be much easier for us to do the IME exams.
Wouldn't that just become more suspect then? Isn't that what the implication was before?
I don't, that's what people suspect, but every company that I work with, they send us the report transcription, I review it, make sure it's accurate, and then I sign off on it.
The folks that are in New York, do you have any additional questions of the IME providers? Or any questions?
Mine was submitted in writing, thank you.
Okay. Better make sure I read it.
I have a question for you guys. Do you find it common, or if you find it to be a rarity, that a customer will ask for multiple IMEs to get, let's say, a result being from total to marked, as far as the level of disability?
Total to mark meaning?
Like a total disability to a more like marked disability or a lesser disability?
When you say multiple, to follow up and have additional ones?
Same specialty? Of the same specialty? No.
You don't find that?
No, the disability rating ones are usually once, unless, it was a temporary, then it may be followed up to see if that changed.
We don't see that either.
One of the questions that was submitted, and I think Tim kind of alluded to it in his opening remarks, was the difference in the role here versus New York. So, you guys want to expand on that, or do you want to potentially add? I believe Brookside is just in New York. So.
Yes.
You mean New York compared to other states?
Correct.
I think Tim kind of touched that. It just really has to do with the amount of paperwork that's required and the deadlines for the physicians. Most other states aren't as restrictive, and the physicians will preclude themselves because if they don't, if they take 35 days to do a report, we're not going to send them the business anyway. So.
Yeah, it's you're unique in that you have an abundance of forms. You're unique in that you have your own language associated with the performing IMEs or impairment ratings. You're unique in that you have very tight guidelines or deadlines associated with report delivery, and you're unique in managing the communication with the provider. It just doesn't lend itself to the greatest environment to attract more physicians, basically. So.
I have a question. Do you track the results of the hearings based upon the administrative law judge's ruling against the IMEs that are done to see how aligned they are?
No, we don't track any outcomes with IMEs.
No visibility, no.
Or we don't have any capability of doing that.
Right.
No,
Sometimes
no,
the party of interest on e-case is only given for a certain time period, so we may not have e-case access to that case once it hits a hearing.
Part of my question for the inter-examiner reliability is that how do your panel physicians match looking at the same patient? And better yet, same patient, same time, the way our medical students are taught, there are standardized patients that are then examined, and then the professors are able to comment. Do you have any training mechanisms in place, or what are your training mechanisms in place to make sure that if a doctor says this person has a marked total disability, that there's 3 other people that look at that same knee are going to say the same thing?
So generally speaking, again, on the, on that component, we don't have visibility to what happens to the, on that report once it's been delivered to all parties. And we don't necessarily have comparative, we wouldn't toggle back and compare that same case because each case is unique. It's an independent, these are not employees of our firm, they're all independent contractors. And again, with the language of New York is as is, the report.
There's no discussion with the doctor to find out if his.
I want to stop because that was my question. My question is, in the first instance, as far as education, enrolling a doctor onto your panel, what education do you have in place that looks to improve inter-examiner reliability so that doctors are examining the same patient with the fixed findings so that you're able to determine whether or not physicians looking at the same material come up with the same responses? Not what you do on the back end. We talked about outcomes before. I'm now switching it for preloading for educational purposes, and so that physicians become familiar with the lexicon of our books and our materials so that it can meet the needs of the injured worker and the employers and the carriers.
So I know any physician that's brought on our panel to do New York workers' comp, we do provide them with the links to the New York State workers' comp guidelines, the medical treatment guidelines, the SLU guidelines, the permanency guidelines. So we're giving them the tools for them to follow it accurately.
So it's an interesting question. We have never delved down, and Crystal and I were talking about this with the inter-examiner component of IMEs. It's not something that we have ever delved into. Certainly not in New York, based on the how it's governed. It's an interesting proposition.
And I honestly don't know that it's an IME entity's role to do so. I
Right,
mean, we're
right.
the
And
facilitator
of
the exams
that's the
and
first part to
process.
the answer.
Yeah.
But if it's something that's of interest, I mean, that's something that we could communicate with the board accordingly on and explore that. But,
Can you tell us, of all the states you work in, which system what do you find works the best? And my criteria for best is get the most reliable reports, timely, that are helpful to the injured worker.
Yep.
Any sense of that?
Yeah, well, I don't want to do all the talking.
I don't know if I could pick one state, but I mean, New York is unique in the sense that all lines of business affords for a high volume of IME referrals. So like states like Maryland, the no fault, the PIP limits are like, what are they, $5,000? So they don't really utilize an IME. So there's a high volume of workers' comp referrals. So in New York, it's just, I think we're just challenged for the fact that it's very regulated for work comp IMEs. The no fault are not as regulated. So you're kind of competing against each other. That who gives the best reports?
Yeah, it's not, no, I know. So
Maybe a different question is, what are some system features across the country
Yep.
that create a positive
Yep.
outcome in the process?
Yep. So I don't think if you break it down again, you're asking, if it's a TPA, if it's an insured, if it's a town or municipality asking, or defense or plaintiff asking for an IME request, you're facilitating an IME. The less work that goes into that for the physician, the better. I'm from the Boston area. I grew up in a claims environment in that area. I think the state of Massachusetts actually has a system that works. If you look at statistics from the DIA in Massachusetts, everything it's a win-win. Claim counts are down, which there are other reasons for that. But there's no problem that emanates out of the DIA. There is no, there isn't a committee looking into the, the IME, role in Massachusetts because it's not broken, basically. And if I were to compare and say, well, what's so good about Massachusetts? It's not that they have programs, it's not that they have policy and programs and procedures, it's that they don't have policy, programs, and procedures. They don't have the rigid guidelines associated with turnaround time. If you engage with an orthopedic surgeon to perform an exam, if it's for a town or municipality that wants an expert opinion, and they want to schedule an exam with an orthopedic surgeon at Massachusetts General Hospital, you'll get that. You'll get, and New York has a very similar demographic. But if you then say, well, you can only get the records this way, the report has to be in, in this many days. You alienate. You have the doctors in New York. You have doctors in New York. Now, you might not have as many doctors in Watertown, New York, as you do in Brooklyn, but you have the doctors. You just have to. If you were to loosen and I dare I say controls, because I understand why things were added to Section 137 over the years, but it's caught up with the environment, basically. So Massachusetts, in answer to your question, I think Massachusetts is a system that's very open. It's very, transparent, and there aren't any necessarily hard guidelines as far as you have to do this within this date and this within that date. And the customers are the best. I mean, a lot of I think a lot of the participants in this committee have visibility to multi jurisdictions. I don't think I've ever heard anybody complain about Massachusetts, basically, as far
Do
as
you
that
think
goes.
that injured workers are in some way harmed by the system in Massachusetts or benefited by it?
No, I think there is no problem whatsoever. I think there is no problem. I mean, I think if you have an injured worker, there are issues that emanate out of just a claim with an injured worker that if they're, but it's not the IME process is not something at fault or at blame or is pointed at in an ugly manner in any way in the state of Massachusetts and in other states as well. But I would gravitate back to Massachusetts because it's just very similar from a demographic and geography standpoint.
It is 10 to 3, and so if there's any last minute questions from the panel.
So,
okay.
It was a couple months ago, we saw some data, and was it 8,000 docs dropped out? What was the number?
I think it was 3,000.
Oh, 3,000.
Yeah.
So, speaking to you guys, is there something with the 3,000 reduction in providers that's perhaps lurking under the surface that we're not yet seeing? Back in January.
Those were not all actively servicing, actively treating or performing IMEs, but they are ones who failed to register. So it did, some of those did subsequently register and come back. But I just want to make sure that that some of those maybe had not performed any services for years, so.
My thought was is there a looming supply issue that perhaps you're seeing that maybe hasn't yet presented itself?
I think in the last year, there's more doctors limiting workers' comp IMEs than ever before.
But there's a national shortage of IME providers.
Yes.
Medical groups continue to consolidate, and we're seeing that these large groups are not allowing the doctors to do consultative work outside their practice. So that, it's a national basis, and most young physicians don't get into IME work. It's usually something they learn from a more senior physician in the practice, and they don't learn this in medical school.
All right, there is one last question that I think we haven't really addressed. I think most of this was addressed by the conversation, but there is one that wasn't. The time spent with the patient by the IME provider is off the question. Are there other things IME providers consider as part of the IME? Again, I'm not sure what context that is.
I think that thought is the patient isn't, or the injured worker is not aware that the physician may have spent an hour reviewing medical records the night before or before they walk into the exam room. So they're not actually reviewing medical records during the IME. They're just doing the consultation at that point.
Physical exam, yeah.
Dictation as well factors into that time.
Yeah, I want to expound upon that too. This is Richard Mascarito from Brookside. I think that the fixation for the time spent with the patient is appreciated, but that's only part of the story. We're dealing with maybe one body part might take an examiner 10 to 15 minutes to evaluate, but there's so much more to it with review of medical records. There could be required research that they have to do. There's the dictation, report preparation, review of diagnostics. Sometimes these doctors are reviewing x-rays, MRIs, in addition to the reports, surgical reports. So there's a lot that goes into the IME other than just seeing the patient.
And that's why we're also seeing increased costs with no-shows, because the physician is putting in so much work before the actual examination, so they're charging for their time.
Hey, it's Rick Weinstein again. I just want to make that point. I agree 100%. The examination is a brief portion of the actual work that's done. And as a busy orthopedist, I could tell you if I'm spending more than 5 minutes examining someone, they've got multiple body parts injured. Most people should be able to be examined in 5 minutes, maybe 10 minutes, unless it's complex and multiple body parts.
Okay, any last minute questions from the group for the IME providers that we feel we haven't covered? All right, I would like to, again, thank you all for traveling here, and for those of you who are in Rochester for participating today. We did have a lot of questions. I think we hopefully ironed out some things. I'm sure there'll be follow-up, but we do appreciate your time. Yes, absolutely.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
The next month, in July 9th, we will be talking about IME conclusions, the accuracy of POIs, duplicate submissions, performed but not filed with the board, and addendums. Again, thank you very much. I look forward to seeing you all in July. Hopefully the sun is shining.